And hello again, my name is Lupus, and I'm doing another of these videos about literary concept nonsense stuff. This is kind of like a second, like a part 2 to the previous video on the channel, which was about Marxism and literature, so I would recommend that one before this one, but if you do understand Marxism in general, then this should be fine. So this is Marxist literary theories, which will be looking at a whole bunch of different theories that are Marxist in tone, and, created by Marxists. We're going to be looking at quite a couple of these theories, I think 7 of them, strictly speaking. So the first one is reductive theories. Now, reductive theories are much more reductive. These are vulgar theories, so vulgar Marxism. Basically, this is the idea that the economic base, so we spoke about in the previous video, the economic base, like economics and what have you, doesn't just influence the superstructure like literature, elements of the superstructure like literature, instead it kind of determines it. So basically, the economic system is a one-to-one relationship with the superstructure. So economics leads to the kinds of narratives that are told, so the kind of literature that is written. So it's a one-to-one relationship. And also when people in power in Marxist countries, or socialist countries that are trying to be communist in some sense, they will often kind of see art as a representation of material class struggle. So you get things like socialist realism, which is this sort of like concept where you would sort of say that art has to be reflective of this economic base structure thing. Basically, literature has to be about class struggle. It can't be about other things, which is like reductive, because it's sort of saying that literature has to be about one specific thing, or literature and other art. Which, yes, so that's reductive / vulgar, because it doesn't really understand what literature, it doesn't really understand art. It doesn't understand that it can be about anything. So yeah, that is a reductive theory. A bunch of like early Marxists had this kinds of thoughts. Then you get Lukács with his, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, I've only ever read these things, reflection theory of literature. Now also, just before I go into the rest of these, because reductive is really easy to say with, because it's kind of terrible, but when it comes to the rest of these, I am not going into that much depth with any of them. This is a general, broad overview of each of these concepts. So if you want to learn more about any of them, then you should go and do that. You will be able to find videos that focus just specifically on each of these things in depth. So yeah, they are all very famous sort of theories, but this is a very, very basic overview of things. So first off, the reflection theory of literature. Basically, the idea that literature acts as a reflection of the real world. So there is a historical relationship, sort of, in terms of this, there is a historical relationship between this and this ancient Greek idea of mimesis. Mimesis is the idea that art imitates life. So literature is an imitation of reality. So in this case, it's a reflection. So it's sort of saying, if you're looking in the mirror of reality, you are seeing back not the actual thing. Literature is not society, it is a reflection of society. So you can sort of see literature as showing you more about the world, because it is essentially always grounded in the material world, which means that, say, the literature that is produced during a particular period of time will be in a certain way. It'll have certain themes and ideas that it might explore based on the societal circumstances in which it exists. Now, let me just say this from my own perspective, my own fiction writing. My fiction tends to be much more sort of postmodern in its application. It's very, very experimental a lot of the time. Well, a lot of it has very experimental forms. It's usually kind of weird stuff, because a lot of my writing is sort of against the more standard traditional ideas of storytelling. So I go against these kind of ideas, which is a reflection of the society that exists now of literature as entertainment. So it's sort of going against that generalized idea, which to me makes it interesting, right? So reflection doesn't mean that, a capitalist world creates capitalist artworks, but rather that a capitalist world creates capitalist artworks and anti-capitalist artworks and things that are ambivalent about capitalism and whatever, basically capitalism is always like there as a possible thing that it could be responding to in some way. It could be agreeing, disagreeing, trying to ignore it. But if you ignore something, that is just as sort of political as not ignoring it. Because if, for instance, you ignore, let's say if you were to set a book in like 1950s America, right, when they had Jim Crow laws, if you were to just conveniently remove the racism, just not mention it, not mentioning it is still a political act. You are removing that particular societal context, which adds something to that fictional world that you have created. So the next one that we're going to look at is the genetic theory, which is Goldman. Basically, there is these ideas of what are called mental structures, which are these shared and dominant structures that are often hidden from people. But these are these mental structures are basically things that we as a society kind of agree. They're dominant, which doesn't mean that everyone agrees with them, but they are things that have come to be seen often as true. But often we don't even notice that they're there. As I say here, they're hidden. They're often hidden from people. People don't necessarily see the ideology that is around them. They don't necessarily see the things when they're, when you watch a Marvel movie, let's just say, that's a good example. When you watch the first of the MCU movies, when you watch Iron Man is a fascinating film because it is both an anti-war movie while also being a pro-military movie. So it's against war, but it's for the military. Which is a very weird it's a very weird thing, right? Because we've kind of decided as a society that war is bad. Right? War is bad. War's a bad thing. However, especially in American society, military is seen as universally good. You're not really allowed to criticize the military or else you're bad. So they want to have anti-war, but they also don't want to anger the military. So they're like, no, we're pro-military, but we're against war, which is very nebulous. So you might watch that movie and not even realize that that is the case. But when you actually start paying attention to it, you'll be like, wait a minute, this is very weird. This is a very weird thing that they're kind of trying to jump between these two ideological positions that aren't really meshing with each other. But, just ignore it because it's a fun movie. That is the kind of thing that happens. So basically, according to the more genetic theory, literature kind of comes out of living within and interpreting this dominant mental structures. So when you learn these kind of big structures, you grow up with them, right? So you can trace their lineage from like a genetic perspective. You can see where they come from, and you might not, especially when something's very old, you might not even realize that there is some kind of an ideology there. If you grew up in a certain culture, you will see that culture as just normal. So you might not even realize that is like a dominant and shared mental structure that you've just accepted. If you grew up in a Christian church and you've never been exposed to any other religious belief whatsoever, say you're in some tiny town in the middle of nowhere and you don't really have contact with the outside world, when you encounter a Muslim person, a Jewish person, a Buddhist person, when you encounter an atheist person, you will be baffled by the existence of this person because now it threatens your dominant structure that you believed in, this mental structure that you believed in. So literature can sort of forms part of these things. It can reinforce or go against these kinds of mental structures. Okay, now the next one is negative dialectic theory, which this one, you can go a lot into this because this is Adorno, and like this kind of stuff you can go really, really far into, like really, this is much deeper. So I'm giving a very basic overview here, but essentially they were looking at how like market values have an effect on the development of literature. So, right, the markets have an effect on it. However, literature can kind of serve as this way of negating market values by instead going towards a kind of true value, a restoration of values that they perceive to be under some threat of some kind. So literature, right, might be existing within a socio-economic context, but it is kind of critiquing that. It is going against that. Like literature doesn't require the kind of, say like a movie. A movie requires a lot of money to be made. A book doesn't actually, like, anyone can really write a book if you sit down and do it. And I do also say that as someone who has written many books. So, you know, if like a writer's going to get angry at that comment, you can. Doesn't mean it's going to be a good book. But anyone can write a book. It might be terrible, but yeah. So anyone can do that, which also means that literature isn't really dominated by market forces unless it is dominated by market forces. Like, someone can just write it for themselves, or you can write it very specifically for economics, but that will come up later. So basically, literature is kind of a way to offer wholeness in a fragmented capitalistic world. So capitalism leads to a fragmented existence in which, you know, it's not like it used to be, right? Communal spaces don't really exist as much. We're taught to treat everything like a commodity. Everything in the world is to be bought and sold and whatever. And literature can be seen as a way of trying to return to a time that meaning was more whole, where it wasn't broken up by the sort of capitalist machine. Now, this is also where it gets into the idea that popular culture is seen as sort of real value and market value being pulled together, which is seen as a negative thing. They see it like that because they all sort of say, like, literature, say a book can be written by whoever, and it can critique, you know, dominant structures. However, in the modern day, books, movies, whatever, are made as just entertainment. They're not there to do something. They're not there to necessarily be about society and to have ideas. They're just there to be fun, to distract you. And they are quite against that. It's the idea of like commodified art. Art just becomes something that you purchase, basically. It doesn't teach you anything. Instead, it is just there to kind of be mind-numbing forever. So it's very fun. Then you get the idea of the structural theory. This is also one that you can go into very, very deep, and that's also very, very influential. So they're looking at this idea that there's different aspects of the superstructure. So remember, the superstructure is the thing that's sort of opposed to the economic base in terms of traditional Marxism. So culture, education, you could also say literature, politics, whatever, they're all parts of the superstructure, right? So I say, like, here, different aspects of superstructure, like education and politics, are called formations in this theory. And they're semi-autonomous. Now, this actually gets rid of the idea that there's a difference between superstructures and the base, because in this idea, economics just becomes part of the superstructure. Economics is one part. It's one of these formations. So you can't say that economics is more important than religion, because it depends on the culture, the specific cultural circumstances of a place. In some places, religion is more important than capitalism. You know, it depends. In some places, race is more important than religion. It depends on where you are that it will be different. And each of these are semi-autonomous, so they kind of exist on their own, but they also influence each other and are influenced by each other. So economics influences, you know, education, and education influences economics. It's a relationship that's going back and forth. So all of these formations together are what make up society. And different ones are dominant in different places and in different ways, as I just said. You know, some places race is more important than economics, and in some economics is more important than whatever. It goes like that. Which also means that literature is just one of those formations. So it influences all the others and is influenced by all the others. It is this constant series of influence going back and forth, which is quite an interesting concept, and it's much less reductive. Remember, the reductive, vulgar Marxist theories were like, no. Economics leads to what happens in the superstructure. So economics directly influences culture. Whereas these people are like, no, it's not that direct. Instead, they are all influencing each other all the time. So yeah, that's quite an interesting one. The last of these ones, before I go into a much longer one, is the production theory of literature. Macquarie, I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly, but whatever. Now there, it's actually looking at the production process of literature. Now, remember that people like to also act as if literature is this thing that's like, oh, it's separate from all the others. But literature is also informed by capitalism. Writers have to eat, which means that they have to be paid in some way to be able to survive. There are publishers that exist, people who sell the books themselves, the people who print the books, and then there's all the things like the symbols in the books, the language that's used, the formal techniques, all the ideological implications that go into it. All of these things are part of the production of literature. They all go together to create what is literature. a writer is a worker. They are existing within an institutionalized system. So they are still workers within this system. So you shouldn't see literature as some special, separate thing. It is still heavily influenced by markets. It is still heavily, heavily influenced. So that is an interesting little final bit there. Now, obviously, each of these ones that I've looked at can be looked at way, way, way more depth than I'm going into. But this is a generalized overview of these concepts. Basically, the study guide I use only has a little bit of information about each of them, and even then I've simplified that way, way down, just to sort of help people to understand them in some basic sense. Now, we're going to go through one which I like a lot more because it's one I kind of care about more, and it's in the study guide. It also actually has much more information about it, and that's the language theory of literature, which is Bakhtin, Mikhail Bakhtin. Now, I love his work. But anyway, so basically, he was not really looking, Bakhtin is interesting because he's not really like a Marxist. He's classified as like a Marxist thinker, but like he was kind of existing within Marxist Russia, or USSR Russia, but his work was kind of seen as not Marxist enough, and so he did actually get in trouble. Like he was exiled and all sorts of things for his writings, and he also published a bunch of his stuff under an assumed name, like not under his real name. So when it comes to him, he instead wants to see how literature and sort of language is a social thing, right? And can be used as a way of undermining dominant structures. Now the thing is, with like a lot of these other sort of Marxists, they want to look at how it undermines capitalist society. And these guys are like, no. Well, Bakhtin is like, no. It can undermine any dominant structure. If a communist system is in control, language can be used to critique that too. So he saw language itself as being inherently social, right? Language is a thing that is social. Language cannot exist without other people. It doesn't really have a purpose then. So some terms that he used are things like the word and the utterance. These are sort of the smallest things within his theory. So the word is obviously the smallest signifying structure, like a word, each individual word is, I just got a message that came through here, which is very annoying because it then influences my audio. It's fine. Let's continue being very unprofessional and not fixing this in post. So, I'm a professional. Anyway, but the word is a smaller signifying structure, and the utterance is basically, an utterance is a series of words that make up some kind of a statement. The utterance is a social aspect of language. You can kind of see it like a sentence, but not actually. So the utterance is needed to understand the broader context in which words exist. Right? Words require other words to make sense. If you just say the word shop, that means nothing. Whereas if I say I want to go to the shops, all of a sudden the word shop now has a new meaning based on its place within that sentence. So, other things he looked at were things like there is the interaction between addressers and addressees, which is called dialogism, like dialogue. A dog just shook herself very close to me. That might be in the audio. Hello, Psyche. Do you want to say hello? Can you speak into this? Those were her little smells against the mic. Did you like that? I don't know if she appreciates this discussion of Marxism. She is like a hardcore fascist, obviously. She's not a fan. And right now she's sitting next to me and I'm scratching her. So, that is obviously more important than actually talking about anything. So, addressers and addressees, a dialogism, like dialogue, right? Now, he kind of argued that there's not really such a thing as like the monologue, but that I will discuss that a little bit, sort of the next paragraph in my notes here. But basically, there is always a social element to language. You can't really get a monologue because even a monologue is talking to yourself as if you're engaging in dialogue. So you're in dialogue with yourself when you're monologuing. So even then, it's not really, So this is why it's the social aspect. That's what's so important here. The social aspect of language, rather than, for instance, looking at it from a linguistic perspective. Right? Like, Bakhtin didn't really care about the idea of, language is made up of, like, linguistic units. It's like, yeah, but it doesn't really matter in terms of, the broader context, because what matters is that those linguistic units are used to communicate with other people to communicate ideas, thoughts, etc., etc., right? So that is a bit of an interesting thing there, which also throws a bit of a wrench in the works of certain, if you were just looking at it from a purely linguistic perspective, which can be kind of detached. So basically, there's always context in which utterances, have to be understood. So, as I said earlier, the monologue doesn't really exist. A monologue is still dialogical. It still requires that you are in conversation with yourself. So it's still dialogue, even though it seems like monologue, which can be kind of weird. Now, this is also where you get into literature. The literary text is dialogical. The reason is because when you're reading a book, basically the writer is talking to you, the reader. So it's you might think, oh, it's just something that's been written. But no, it's been written for a purpose. It has been written to be read. Even something that was written for just you, say a diary, if somebody else was to read it, they would still understand it, which means that it is dialogical. It means that it is talking to me and I am understanding what it is saying. I am learning from this particular social thing. That is why it is dialogical rather than monological. So, when it comes to Bakhtin's work, because of all this stuff, he privileged the utterance over, things like everything else, like above linguistics. It was about what actually the social context in which language exists was more important than language, like in an abstract sense. He didn't care about nouns and verbs. He cared about how they were used to communicate and to communicate ideas. And this also, when it comes to literature, and not just literature, but like everything, where the voice becomes a privileged thing. The voice is the material aspect of speech. But you can look at all sorts of things, like you can say the voice of the marketplace, the voice of the courtroom, the voice of wherever, because these places have a certain dialogical structure that exists within them that makes them understandable as social spaces. You understand what a marketplace is before you go there. So that's a fun little thing. And then when it comes to the actual voices in the literary texts, you can see something like the narrator, the narrator, right? The narrative voice. Who is the person that's always talking to you, saying, John walked to the shops, right? That's a person speaking in dialogue to you. And then you could say the various voices of the characters. Are they different to each other? Are they the same as each other? Blah, 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 blah. The dialect that is used, there's all sorts of stuff like this. Which this is also called multi-voicedness, where there's like lots of different voices interacting with each other at the same time. And then heteroglossia is a form of sort of multi-voicedness, which is the idea that you can have multiple voices that are essentially doing the same thing but in two different voices. So, like, heteroglossia would be, parody is a good example that is mentioned in the study guide, where basically parody is a simultaneous, it's the parodied thing, but you also actually, to truly understand it, you need to know what is being parodied. So it's saying two things at once. It is saying the joke, that is the parody, and it is also calling attention to the original text. So it's saying two things at once. It has two voices at the same time. The serious and the silly. And this is also where you can get into the idea of, like, say, the carnivalesque. The carnivalesque is a very interesting concept by Bakhtin, where the carnivalesque is based on old, very, very old ideas about, where there were these carnivals where the lower classes, the grotesque, the supposedly unpleasant, were all like allowed to be. So, right, in standard society, you can't have jokes and whatever about gross things, but there's a period in which you can, where you can be sexual and weird and you can dance in the streets because it's a carnival. It's everybody's just like doing whatever. You're letting yourself go. And literature can do this too. You can be irreverent. You can be like, oh, I'm going to take something everyone thinks is serious and I'm going to make it not serious. I'm going to critique it. I'm going to mock it, which is something that literature is able to do, which allows then marginalized voices to be given room where they wouldn't usually be allowed to. So like literature can elevate marginalized voices into a dominant arena where others can see it and understand it. However, this is still an extremely basic overview of Bakhtin's work. Bakhtin was very, very influential, and I love Bakhtin's work. I could talk about Bakhtin for ages, but this is as far as I'm going to go for now in terms of Bakhtin. By the way, dog is still here, but now she's fallen over, so now I have to scratch her with my leg, otherwise, or my foot, otherwise I'd have to bend over and make this, and I can't read my own notes. So she's being very difficult with me, and she's up to change position for her. Yes, Psyche, just stay there, because if you move, then I can't scratch you. Lie down. Come on, lie down. There we go. Okay. Psyche says hi. So the final thing I want to just look at is a couple of issues with Marxism that can happen in terms of literary and not literary. Marxist theory can be a bit of a problem because it sees itself as sort of a final truth. It's sort of saying this is the truth, which you could say is still ideological, and could be perceived as incorrect or reductive in a sense. So that's a bit of a problem that you can look at. Marxism also often evades questions that make it complicated. For instance, when those Marxists who are more reductive are like, no, economics is the most important determining factor. And then you're like, well, what about things like race, gender, etc., etc.? These things aren't determined by economics. And they'll kind of just ignore that because it's a bit inconvenient and it makes the theory less like one-to-one. It makes it much more complicated, which can be a bit of a problem. You do get more modern Marxists who will look at things a bit more fairly in that sense. So, yeah. The next one is the failure of Marxist economics can be seen as a bit of a nail in the coffin, right? Marxist economics kind of failed. It didn't beat capitalism. Capitalism kind of changed a bit, and also Marxism in places like the USSR didn't ultimately work for a variety of reasons, but even though it was never actually true communism that existed in those places, people who don't understand that will just think, oh, well, communism failed. Right, like that, like USSR, it failed in like 1989, it all fell apart. So, even though it was not actually true communism, people don't know that. So, yeah. Another little problem is that in the modern era especially, the proletariat does actually have an influence on economics. It's not just economics that has an influence on the proletariat. So the poor do have an influence. It's also in things like literature, right? When something becomes really popular, right? When it becomes really popular, it's often popular because poor people really love it. And they go to the movies and they see these things. And then that informs the market, and then more people make those things based on that supposed market that exists. So it's not as one-to-one as it's sort of laid out in a lot of sort of older Marxist stuff. And then the last thing I'm going to put is that this also does relate to an earlier one, is that late-stage capitalism has kind of incorporated certain socialist principles, things like minimum wages, maximum working hours, stuff like that, which has led to it basically being more resistant to revolution. Because when like Marx was writing, capitalism had even fewer restrictions on it. Like that was, if you look at like Victorian England, people were getting like maimed in machines, and then they would just become homeless basically. Nowadays, well, it's difficult to say because now things are getting worse and worse every day, but there are things like unemployment insurance, there are things like disability assistance, stuff like this, which did not exist back then. So it is better than it was, but when things do get better, they find new ways to make it worse. So, yeah. Anyway, these are just a couple of things to keep in mind when it comes to Marxism, because even if you do believe in socialist principles, you do need to look at the problems, because you're only going to be able to solve those problems if you actually interrogate them. And I say this as someone who's very, very left-wing. I'm extremely far left. So I am pretty much like a little Marxist, but you need to take in those criticisms and you need to actually work with them. So that's where we're going to end things. If you enjoyed this, cool, I'm glad. You can support me and this channel if you did like it by checking out some of my books. The sort of latest novel that I put out there is Fleshstone Blues. And Fleshstone Blues is definitely something you can look at from a Marxist perspective, because it's a cyberpunk story in which mega corporations sort of rule the world. Governments have been eroded to the point of near irrelevance, and everything is just terrible all the time. It's a horrible world, but there are some nice things. We figured out how to transfer our consciousness into chips, so we can have whatever body we want, but that also means that we theoretically can never die, but that would be bad for the economy. So instead, you can, once your life tax becomes too high, you can just, pay to go to heaven, because we can do that now. So, definitely a text that can be looked at from a Marxist perspective. So, if you like the idea of that, you could check it out. Otherwise, you can also like, comment, subscribe, do all those kind of things. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments. And if you have a particular literary theory that you would like told about or explained in more simplified terms, I might just be able to do that. So if that is something that you're interested in, please, you can put it in the comments and say, and I will see if I can do such a thing. I will see if I can. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, week, and month ahead, and please, goodbye.